Welcome to the Choralosophy Podcast. I'm Chris Muntz. Does the performative nature of most of our choir programs lead to exclusion? That's the topic of this episode with Dr. John Perkins of Butler University. In 2018, in December, he wrote an article in the Choral Journal called "What is Written on Our Choral Welcome Mats?" In the article, Dr. Perkins seeks to tie the tendency toward valuing a performance standard and competition in choral culture to racial and cultural prioritization. As the reader, I found myself bouncing back and forth between agreement and disagreement with the premise. While I do see the pernicious influences of competitiveness in choir, for example, choir is not a sport, I do not share his view that this can be tied in any way to race or culture. I've just seen too many kids of every shade become very competitive with choral music, and some that just don't care about that aspect of it. I think that that's something that we might be adding unnecessarily to the conversation. So I just had to talk to him about this, and he graciously accepted the invitation to parse out the particulars in the article. The end result was a civil and productive conversation that left me a greater understanding of his view on the topic, and I hope you find it informative. Did you know that SightReadingFactory.com has custom settings that match up with the sight reading criteria of different states and their competition rules? I didn't know that until too long ago, and I'm a spokesperson for them here on this show. They recently added my home state of Missouri, and I'm excited to be able to use that with my students in the fall to help them get ready for their all-district choir audition. So it's something you might want to check out to see if they have your state. And of course, if you get on there and get a membership, don't forget to use Choralosophy at checkout to use that as a resource in your classroom and save 10% while doing it. I would also encourage you to head over to ryanmain.com as you are planning your literature selections for next school year, especially if you work with those middle school and high school students like I do. Tons of great arrangements on his website and some original compositions that are really ideal for that age group that your students will love. So head over to ryanmain.com, use Choralosophy at checkout, and get 10% off. Before going to the full interview with John Perkins, I would like to give you a little bit of background on why I chose to do this episode. It was about a couple of weeks ago when I had posted a promotion for episode 8 of the show, where Beth and I talk about the importance of classical voice training, bel canto training, as a foundational concept for young singers. We believe very strongly that if a kid has never sung before, that's a really good place to start. It covers all the bases, and it's healthy and teaches them about the physiology of the voice, how to master their instrument, so to speak, and creates a window for them into all types of other singing areas and the ability to make their voice sound the way they want it to sound. That's the way we see it, and we didn't really see that as all that controversial. However, I posted an ad for that show on the ACDA webpage, and about 100 or so people liked it. A whole bunch of people shared it. Didn't seem to be all that controversial until we got about 20 comments down the page and discovered that the claim had been made that classical training is only good essentially for kids in white upper-class suburban schools, in which case the claim was then made in that scenario, in that post, that our claim that classical singing is the ideal starting place for most students and for kids who learn to sing in choir is somehow itself a racially biased statement. So, of course, I took issue with that. My first thought was, well, I just need to let that go and not respond to it. But I couldn't, because I didn't feel like that was the integrity thing to do. It's my honest opinion. I believe that what I had said and what Beth and I said in episode 8 was true and well thought out. And, of course, investigated and questioned over decades of combined experience. So we got into the conversation a little bit more on that chat on Facebook regarding whether or not singing a certain way inherently has a race or has a culture. My argument is that it doesn't, that people of every skin color on every continent have learned to sing in a classical style and have gotten a lot of joy and a lot of love and a lot of appreciation for art from that. Now, of course, that does not mean to say that people who sing in any kind of indigenous or learned by ear, I guess you could say non-academic style of music, which Dr. Perkins and I will hash out what that means quite a bit in this episode. None of that is to say that those types of singing are bad or that are not valuable. In fact, I'll also argue that those are extremely valuable. They're just different. And that's essentially all I was trying to claim. And of the people who criticized our point of view in that thread on Facebook, John Perkins was kind enough to post a link to an article that he had written on this very topic, and I jumped right into it and started reading it. And I found it fascinating, and I wanted to give just a little bit of background into what I was thinking as I was reading it. First of all, it popped out to me from the philosophical part of my brain, which was that this is definitely an article written from a postmodern critical theory perspective. Postmodern critical theory politicizes social problems by situating them in their historical and cultural contexts. In fact, that is the core tenet of critical theory, is that an issue cannot be looked at outside of the social, historical, cultural context. In many of the social sciences, research is done with this premise and this perspective in mind from the outset. Oftentimes, there is a hypothesis generated a priori that involves some type of oppression occurring. And one of the tenets also of postmodernist critical theory is that there is always an oppression occurring. In everything that you are trying to analyze, you can find an oppressor and an oppressed group of people. The problem I have with that is that if you start with that premise, this is true in lots of areas, you will find what you're looking for. If your starting place is that there is a villain, you can look at literally anything and discover that there is a villain, that there is somebody who's being excluded, somebody who's having their way of life snuffed out or colonized or whatever it is. Now, one of the things that I find as somebody who comes at this from a different perspective, which is that I believe music and art and really all things can be looked at independent of politics and culture. They can be looked at in a non-social way. In other words, I can determine that a chord is in tune based on the overtone series, based on whether or not those things line up. To me, it's physics. It's not something that is that I perceive or I prefer because of the culture that I've been raised in. I can measure it, right? These are things that are very measurable. Now, that is not the same as I think it's better or I think the other styles of music or singing are less important. To me, it's just two different ways of looking at it. So this article seems to be written from that perspective, which is that we need to question whether or not the way we teach choral music as being a prioritized system that reinforces quote-unquote excellence, in which case, how do we define excellence? Maybe it is that we've defined excellence in a way that is culturally biased. Now, bottom line, I think that John is coming at this topic in good faith, something I've talked about on this show a lot. It's why I was so excited to talk to him about this. I disagree with the way he looks at it, but I think he's looking at it with the genuine intent to try to do good in the choral profession. And by me disagreeing with him, I am also trying to do good in the choral profession by furthering a conversation that I think is important. I think that the critical theory perspective on looking at the world is a vital part of the way that we look at societal problems. I just don't think it's sufficient on its own. I think it can't be used as a dominating worldview. I think it has to be sprinkled in sparingly as we look at the things that are the real injustices in the world. And maybe I'm idealistic, maybe I'm overly optimistic. I have been accused of that before, but I just don't see choir as one of those places. I see the choral music world as one of the few shining beacons and shining lights on the hill, if you might use the term, of a community that's very inclusive, a community that is always striving to, for example, put together a concert that really spans the globe and a curriculum. I don't know any choir director worth their salt that doesn't believe that a choral curriculum for students shouldn't include music from all types of cultural backgrounds, time periods, really, you name it. It should be a diverse music education, and I think really we all believe that. So I see our profession in this way as already doing a really, really good job at cultural inclusion. Now, that is not to say that we can't still do better. And I think that's really where the conversation between John and I really gets going is okay, how do we do this better going forward? And I will let the interview speak for itself beyond that. But I think that's some interesting background for you to consider as you listen to this conversation, to kind of get an idea of where I'm coming from and wanting to understand a perspective on this topic that is so vastly different than my own. Are you finding these conversations helpful? Do you think these are topics that we should be talking about more often as they affect our choral profession? If so, you now have the opportunity to be a Patreon patron for Choralosophy. If you head over to patreon.com/choralosophy, for as little as $3 a month, you can become a choralosopher officially by subscribing to the show. If you choose to do that, you will have access to some patron-only content, including behind-the-scenes outtakes from the episodes, updates on show production, merchandise, and a variety of other things. So head over to patreon.com/choralosophy. Well, I'm here with John Perkins, the Associate Director of Choral Activities at Butler University, and I'm really excited to talk with John today about his article, What's Written on Our Choral Welcome Mats, that was published in the Choral Journal back in December. I think it's a really fascinating article that deserves to be fleshed out a little bit more, and so we will dive right into that conversation. Welcome, John.
Thanks so much for having me on, Chris.
So here's what I'd like to start. Here's the I guess a sad reality about podcast listeners. Sometimes we, and I count myself in this category, listen to things because we don't have time to read them. So I want to make sure that first of all, the link to this article that we're going to discuss today will be in the show notes. But if you don't have time to go and read it for full context, John, in your own words, what can you do to summarize and tell us the story of what this article is, so that people have the full context of this conversation?
Yeah, couple lenses that I looked through when I was writing it were the lens of, and we hear this term so much, student-centered education, and what does that really mean? When I was in the Middle East, it meant something very different than teaching in my graduate work and teaching high school here in the US. So that just sort of gave me the problem for this article. Actually, it was seeing it through my students' eyes. And then the second lens is justice-seeking education. Where does that have a place in choral music? Some people would argue that it should be the lens we look through. Other people, I think in the past it hasn't been, at least not in my education, so I can only speak for myself. And so there were problems that came up because of my very exclusive education in undergrad, master's, and doctorate. And they were great educators, great people. But when we talk about oppression and exclusion, it's not always the people, it's the systems that we're part of. And so this article questions some of those, I believe, fairly unquestioned systems, or maybe just kind of frames it in another light, so that we can start to think about those ways in which people who may never even want to be in a choir could feel like they have access to it, and that it represents America, right? We can't be everything to everyone, but we can certainly be a lot more welcoming and to find out who is it? Why are choirs getting whiter and whiter? Why are they getting more middle class and upper class? Whereas it used to not actually be that way in the U.S. So
Interesting. It is I was not aware that because that doesn't jive with my experience at all. My choirs are getting less and less white.
oh, okay.
Um, uh,
Where are you in the
I,
States?
well, I'm in Lee Summit, Missouri, which is a suburb of Kansas City, and
Cool.
I grew up in this town, so I graduated in the school district that I now teach in. My graduating class was 450 kids, 6 of whom were of color.
Hmm.
And now we are a population that is more closely representative of the national population demographically.
Hmm.
So it's become quite a bit more diverse. It's still primarily or a majority white community,
Hmm.
but it's not nearly as exclusively white, which I think has actually been an amazing thing. Just the choral and the cultural influences in our ensembles has been so. It's interesting that I would be interested to see data on that choir as a whole is becoming whiter and more affluent, because that's definitely not where what I see where I am.
I think, yeah, for sure, there are going to be different. We're all going to have different situations in the different pockets that we're in the U.S. The Elpis and Abril article that's cited in my article speaks to that, and I think he's done some really amazing data collection across the U.S. on that, and so that's what he's saying anyway.
Okay, so back to the article in the background before we dive into the nuts and bolts of it. Um, what led to the writing itself? Was it originally intended to be a choral journal article, or were you writing
Mhm.
it for some academic purpose prior?
Yeah, I thought actually, um, I was thinking of a couple different journals, but I know the readership of the Choral Journal is wide, and I wanted to put this out there in kind of a broader context. So
Okay.
that was the intent.
How would you summarize kind of the key points of the article? What is it that you're criticizing more specifically, so that the listener gets that context?
Well, what I find, and again, like we were just saying, these are all very specific to our own experiences. But what I found is that, so I was in the Middle East and working with singers that had never been in a choir ever. So every semester we had to teach them how to hold the football, how to tie your cleats, how to do all those basic things. And I found myself after a couple of semesters of being there getting so caught up in those aspects that the students, what I should say is I noticed when they were having a transformative experience, and it wasn't when we were teaching those technical aspects. And I sort of became a little bit more fluid in trying to figure out, well, how come this thing that I learned about performance, because really my 3 degrees were about performance, right? Um, it was a MM and a DMA and a composition undergrad, but everything kind of drove toward performance. And I thought to myself, well, if I could take the pressure off them, of course, this is something a lot of people know and understand. Um, they actually ended up getting better, right? When I did that, and they finding that finding that sense of identity. We started doing more Arabic choral music. If we did even one piece, which in the beginning was almost a token piece, then we started to make it the majority of our repertoire. The students were just going crazy. I mean, more people, double the people would come back the next semester. They were so proud of their own heritage. They saw themselves in the music, though they had never had a chance to sing that music before. So it just it put this problem in my head about performance. And it made me think, well, how come my goals have only been, not only, but pedagogically have been focused primarily in the bag or in the area of performance, to the point where we could lose out on so much more, right? What else is there that choral music does? And so that's been something that's been sticking in my head probably for the last 10 years, and it's been bothering me. And so I've been trying to find out different pedagogies and different values of choral music. What can I make my goal? Of course, we're going to perform, nothing wrong with performance, but a lot of times I found if I made my goals different, if I made them much more about a project or a society or something that had a maybe higher meaning, then the performance actually came along better. People learn faster, right? And so having that shift in my mind, it's not always just a shift of like, am I going to do this grand project versus a standard stand up and sing performance? But having that shift in my mind kind of has changed, and it still hasn't shifted. I still default to that. I think we tend to default back to our first experiences. But that's just kind of a struggle I've been going through. So I wanted to look into it in more depth, and research certainly helps us to read more and think more and put ideas together more. So that was sort of where I was when I wrote the article.
Okay, that's great. So could you summarize then the two? You start the article with two stories that seem to be. You mentioned that they're fictitious names, but they're two stories that are kind of representative of situations you've come across along this topic. Could you summarize those again, for the ones who don't have time to read?
Yeah, sure. So I had a student in the Middle East, Caleb, who came to my choir. We were poking around, and we had auditions, because I thought, oh, they've got to at least be able to sing kind of 5-note scales and things like that. So it was a very easy audition. But I'm poking around the keyboard, pitch matching wasn't happening, the scales weren't happening. So I told him, all right, the deal was in my head, you can take my oral skills class, which is like oral skills and theory combined, and then definitely 100% you can be in the choir after you take that course. So he did. So he came back, he took the course, he came back the next semester, auditioned, he got in, he was fine. Um, I found out later that he was like a star in terms of Arabic singing. And I heard him sing in Arabic. At that point, we had just started this Arabic choir. It was SATB, fully Arabic repertoire choir. And I heard him sing. So the students brought him to me. They said, okay, you've got to hear this guy do some of these solos. And I thought, oh boy, here we go. Because he has trouble just, staying on his part. And it was just phenomenal. I mean, it was absolutely beautiful. And I thought, man, if I had only auditioned him in Arabic, I wonder what would have happened instead of, do, 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 those types of things. And it was gorgeous, and in his own language even, right? And so there was that access point that I had missed, right?
Mm-hmm.
As a someone who's supposed to know everything about music, at least that's how the students understood it. And of course, they taught me a lot more. The second story is Gentil. A couple of years ago, we had this big Congolese choral festival. It was really a refugee choral festival at our church. And this one pastor at a local church, he's got about 200 people in his church who are all Congolese refugees, hosted it. So we had about 500 people there from all over the states. It was really cool. This one woman, she sang a solo early in the day. It was a 12-hour all-day event. It was pretty wild. And they just kept shouting for her to come back up and sing more and more every single time. I mean, our choir, who didn't understand the language, was in tears. Everybody was in tears when she sang. So she comes up to me and says, so how do I get into Butler? I want to be a voice performance major. And I sat there thinking to myself, you wouldn't make it based on the criteria. She's comes from a really poor household. She can't afford to take lessons to sing art songs, essentially, which is the criteria to get to be a voice major at Butler. How is she going to do this unless someone volunteers their time? And is that even going to really help her? Because she's already a phenomenal singer. Her 10,000 hours are in the bag. Is that going to mess her up more? Because we don't offer kind of a wide variety of singing. She doesn't even have two choices. She has one choice to choose from, and that's bel canto. And so my response was, here's my card, email me. And we kind of looked at some other programs that had some more CCM style voices, but that still doesn't really even embrace the style that she's singing in, right? Her sound is completely unique to the West. I don't know if a voice teacher would know what to do with her. So it just makes me think like, well, this stinks, because like she's going to add more to our music program than we can give her back. right?
Right.
And
I,
so,
I wanted to.
yeah,
It's okay. I'm going to jump in on that one real quick because I've
sure.
got a perspective about that. I've also had one of the stories that I read in your article that I mentioned before the show that resonated with me is I've had a similar experience. I worked at a church that had a refugee choir. I didn't have any direct responsibility to direct it. I would have been
Mhm.
unqualified to direct it, but it was part of our music department, part of the offerings of the church.
Cool.
Um, and and so I've seen similar situations. But my thought is with this student, with Shanti, if she were to express that she wants to be part of a voice performance program, uh, did you get the sense, or do you think you're getting the sense in that instance that you're thinking of, that she was wanting to learn how to sing in a bel canto classical style, but just didn't?
No, I did have some follow up with her, and she really just wanted a recording career. So she
Oh,
wanted to do
okay.
Congolese music in the U.S. for refugee communities.
Now, see,
So
that's interesting because what I probably would have told that person would, and I will apologize ahead of time to an academic who works at a university. I would have said, stay the heck away from universities
yeah,
because and that's, I think that's where the distinction is for me, is I don't feel like um, not every type of music making should be learned in an academic environment.
right.
A lot of folk styles and indigenous styles
Hmm.
that are best taught by word of mouth over generations from grandma, or singing around your home with family members, and that those types of music exist in all cultures. By the
Yeah,
way,
right.
um, that would be the last thing that I would tell that person to do, would be go to try to formalize your education in any way. And so I guess I don't see it as much as a problem of the university that we don't offer those types of things. I think that that there are certain types of music making that require an academic approach because of their very nature. And I think sometimes we run into the danger of thinking that we conflate those two issues with, because academics consider them valuable, that we should culturally consider them more valuable. And to me, it's apples and oranges. It's not one's more valuable than the other. It's that we need both. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you're saying. That the there are places we can learn this, but if the university, many would think this. Maybe if they said it out loud, they wouldn't agree. But in their subconscious minds, I can see our students, and also at the at Temple, where I was a graduate assistant, University of Arizona. They see the university as the place. It's higher education, right? This might be the last stop for folks to learn about their voice. And when they study exclusively one technique for 4 years, I don't care if it's bel canto or jazz or whatever. Um, they're not actually given the tools to discover those other ways. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah.
I have a hard time trying to imitate a Congolese sound or a Chinese sound or even singing pop for that matter. I just revert right back to the way I was taught.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and even though I'm struggling against it, it's still real darn hard. And when I try and get my choirs to change the sound, they can do it in a rehearsal or two, but by the concert, they're going to revert generally back. They're going to take not 2 steps back, but maybe like 10 steps back from where we went, um, with finding that new vocal style, because it's the perception of it. That the student evaluations I get too are like, well, Dr. Perkins is hurting my voice. He doesn't know anything about vocal technique. I'm like, no, we talked about this. We're trying a different vocal technique. But then, what they're saying, well, don't, the professors, the voice professors will say, don't try that. That's going to mess up, because they're really trying to get one thing, right?
Right.
And the other thing is going to mess up what they're trying to do. So
But
in a sense, it should be opened a little bit.
yeah, to be fair though, to the voice professors, they are trying to get the students to do the one thing that their students came there for.
Yeah.
That's
Well,
what they're paying for.
not their music ed students.
Well, true. Yeah, absolutely.
So so this is where the system, like, I talk about this in the article because I start to see these systems where we're inbreeding in a way. the students learn one way as a best way. Then they go and teach that to their students who, by the way, in 2014, our country became a majority non-white K through 12 experience.
Hmm.
So 51% of K through 12 kids are non-white, and many white students also don't really want to learn how to sing bel canto either. And it's not a want to; it's just that there needs to be a diversity of ways. What we found in the Middle East, which was interesting, is we had a number of students. My wife also had the privilege of teaching there. She taught voice, and I taught the choir and theory area. And she found these kids could sing in their native sound, their native vocality. They could learn bel canto. They could also learn jazz, but just having like two ways opened them up to like 3 and 4 different voice styles. My students at Butler, I cannot get them to change fundamental. And it's not just, I think this is a gut feeling, but I think it's not just that they can't change because they're really focusing on one thing, but it's a will. It's like there's not a need to, right? But here's the dominant and everything. The students in the Middle East, they were like, oh, we don't know what's supposed to be dominant or normal or whatever. They could just try 3 or 4 different styles and switch really fluidly back and forth. I think high schoolers can do that too a little bit because they're listening to more pop music, or high school kids. I don't know. You're a high school teacher, and so I don't want to speak for high school teachers, but when I go and visit high schools, I can get the sound to change much more quickly.
Yeah, they're less the synapses are less insulated by the myelin sheaths. If you want to get really neurological,
Yeah.
they are more flexible neurologically at that age, which is one of the reasons I enjoyed teaching high school. But yeah, I think an interesting perspective that I was kind of hoping to see in the article, I want to bounce across you. I didn't see it, which is that it seems to focus on the inherent knowledge of the singer who comes to your ensemble that comes from their culture and their musical culture, which I'm sure that is true in some cases. However, my experience is that most of the kids that come to me, and I don't care what part of the world they come from, we have quite a few African refugees, and then African American students, which, by the way, is a completely different culture.
Sure.
And the assumption, I think we have to be careful, is assuming that they have any musical background at all. So in other words, not everyone does. So you might come from a culture that has a rich musical heritage, but that doesn't mean you've necessarily been exposed to it. And so what I've found is that the most common musical culture that I have to kind of bridge in order to teach more traditional choral music in my classroom is not the music from where they come from. It's the music from their iPods. It's pop music. And I don't care where I don't care if you're an African immigrant, a student who came from Latin America and speaks Spanish primarily, and I have those in my classroom too, or if you're 10th generation white kid from the Midwest, I'm noticing more and more common musical culture among all those kids because of the technologies that they all walk around with. Right. And that's actually more unifying. And so if I to try to teach teach them to sing, obviously in a choral ensemble, there's a practical aspect where there does have to be, I would make the argument that there does have to be a way that you do it. Because if it's a free-for-all, then in other words, kids can't choose their own way to sing in an ensemble. It doesn't work from a physics standpoint. And so, but it's not. I don't find myself fighting against, say, with that African refugee student or immigrant student. I don't find myself fighting against their cultural background of singing. I find myself fighting with the pop music in their their iPods. So that's just an interesting, I guess, third perspective to add to the conversation.
So I'm trying to put that into a nutshell. Are we talking about choral blend, or are we talking about like different ways of resonating, or?
Well, yeah. So I'm very much unapologetically a teacher of bel canto singing in my choral classroom. it is the in the way I see it. I noticed a couple times in your article there was what seemed like a little bit of incredulity around the idea that there is such a thing as vocal health
Mm-hmm.
that can be measured. And I would push it back about that pretty strongly. But I think that's kind of what, in my mind, bel canto helps a student access not necessarily a style of literature, because there are correlations for sure with bel canto singing and then literature that goes along with that, but it's not exclusive. It's not a causal relationship. I do agree with what you said earlier about how once you've kind of built some habits, it's hard to switch back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
But the way I would explain it, let's say we're kind of fortunate in our high school program where we do have quite a few students who study classical private voice outside, probably in a program of over 300 kids. We've got 60 to 70 kids that do that, and of variety of racial backgrounds, cultural backgrounds that all participate in that and love it, and all of that. And so one of the things I do quite a bit is I use resonance imaging software on a big screen in my classroom and show kids the overtones and how overtones create the vowels that we perceive and all of that. So for me, it's very sciencey
Mm-hmm.
in my classroom. And so the way I would think of it is if I took my young 17-year-old African American female student and who is classically trained and had her singing an ah vowel on a C natural in the middle of the treble clef, and put that image up on the screen, and then had a white student with a different background, but achieving that same vowel, same pitch, then you would see that they're the same. And so,
Yeah,
I think
you can get people to sound the same.
well, no, it's not that you can get them to sound the same. It's that they would have the same. An ah vowel is an ah vowel because of the overtones that are created. That's what makes it an ah vowel. That's how we perceive it as an ah vowel, for example. So there is a certain neurological component where we interpret that overtone series and the amount of loudness and softness of each overtone above the fundamental pitch. And it's getting super nerdy, I know,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
but that's what causes our brains to perceive it as ah. Now, what I think we have to be careful is to not conflate, is a value judgment attached to that.
Right.
So, for example, if I say, "This is what a pure ah vowel sounds like," okay, and it's a pure ah vowel in terms of now there's a singer's formant. I can see that up on the screen. It's at the top. I can see that the right number of overtones are amplified in the right series, and that's what a pure ah vowel sounds like. But that's not the same thing as saying, "Here's what the best kind of ah vowel sounds like."
Yeah.
Um, and so I think I don't think we need to avoid the language of, here's what we're trying to achieve, as long as there's not a value judgment. Because if I took that same, in fact, I've got a student in mind, and you used some fake names, so I'll use a fake name. I'm not as creative with fake names. I'm just going to call her Tina. Her
Okay.
name's Tina, and that same student, young African American, classically trained young lady, who has a background, her upbringing is in a Black church with gospel singing background.
Mm-hmm.
If I were to ask her to belt that same C natural, she could just do it. She could switch right back and forth.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned before, having those two different ways of singing is helpful. But at the same time, and she and I have had this conversation, she would probably tell me that one of those is a little bit more taxing on her voice. And so that's where I would get into, like, okay, well, there is a vocal health component to that, where you would have to listen to your body, and you would have to sing in one way, a little bit more carefully, and we would have that vocal health conversation, which I think we shouldn't shy away from also.
Yeah, I think the issues of vocal health and check out the dissertation. Oh, actually, no, it's a chapter that I cited by my wife, who actually talks more about this than I do. The issues about vocal health, we have to be really careful about how they can be put together with what we're used to, conflated with what we're used to versus what. So we went to China and had a couple Chinese opera vocal lessons. And if you've ever heard Beijing
Oh yeah.
opera, it is not bel canto, right?
It's intense. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
intense.
So it was great. So the teacher, it was unique because she had studied at IU. She studied opera singing at IU as a master's student. So she was like, you have to be pretty good to get into IU, and she was. And then she came back and had finished her career into her late 60s as a Beijing opera singer, and had sort of retired into the university. And so she was teaching us how to sing with this style. And she kind of talked about breath support. And I was like, hey, this all sounds really familiar. Awesome. But then she said, now, she pointed to her ribs, from here up is totally different. Well, from here up is totally different. She said, all the stuff that I learned at IU is the same that I was taught as a kid how to sing in the Beijing opera to keep myself healthy. But she said, but the resonance is different. The vowels are flatter. They actually are all over the place. They're back and forward. And it's a high larynx. And that's not unhealthy. And so I thought to myself, well, that's crazy. A high larynx, is that going to be sustainable? And she sounded great. She demonstrated it. And I thought, oh my gosh. And I heard her, I went on YouTube and YouTubed the heck out of her later and heard all these amazing, recordings of her in the 60s and everything. And boy, she sounded the same. And I thought, no, her voice hasn't wavered a bit since the 60s. So it does give me pause to think about, what do we prefer? And I get the challenge. Like, I feel so. I'm reading this really great book, White Fragility by D'Angelo. Really, probably the best book on race that I've read. It just is so clear, and it's for white people, right? So I'm reading it as a white person and hearing the arguments against things that are possibly the same types of arguments when we prefer a style of music, or when we've been taught only one thing and when we haven't questioned them. So it just makes me think, like, what are the things that are unquestioned in my life that I haven't considered as a white person, or as a person in a lot of dominant categories? Having economic advantage as a middle class, even a lower middle class person, allow me to go to Westminster Choir College and learn a certain tradition and not question that, because it was the only thing that was taught. And then I started to question things a little bit more in my master's and doctoral programs. So we would have like one piece that was a little bit different on the program. We got to sing in Mandarin and go to Taiwan and China. But again, like, because of privilege, I have this. So it just makes me wonder, like, okay, what are my timbral preferences? And at first, I have to be honest, when I started listening to Arabic music, I was like, oh man, they're out of tune. They sound horrible. I mean, this was going on in my head. They definitely have like bad vocal technique. That's the first impression. I remember like writing down my first impressions of Arabic music. And I practiced it a little bit. I got into it. I go, oh, well, they're not out of tune. They're singing microtonally.
Right.
The music sounds sloppy because it's heterophonic. It's not supposed to be together. They're improvising around a melody all at the same time, and that's beautiful. And it's never going to be the same way twice. They're learning about a style rather than, or about an emotion that brings out that style, rather than a certain way to sing it. And of course, it comes from the Arabic, the way people pronounce Arabic, right? That's right. How probably every vocal style, it comes right out of the language.
I'm gonna push you back a little bit, back to the vocal health topic, because I'm not sure we're talking about that still.
Okay.
Are you suggesting that your preferences could affect something at the physics level in the vocal mechanism?
No, but I could use vocal health as a way of justifying that, as a way of supporting my preferences. Oh. And saying, and I've heard that a lot, like, well, bel canto is the only healthy way to sing. And I think, I know a lot of people that ruined their voice singing bel canto as well. And it didn't work for them.
But they would be not singing it very well.
It depends. It depends. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if everyone's voice is cut out for it, honestly.
Well, no, and I would agree. And I would actually say that also would apply to the Chinese opera singer. Not every Chinese person
exactly.
is going to be a good Chinese opera singer.
Yeah,
In the same way that not every Italian person was a good opera singer during the 1600s.
right.
It's that. So those are some issues to be careful of too. It's like
Hmm.
we assume we don't want to assume that because the music is of the culture that you were accidentally born into, that it needs to stay your music. And there's a certain amount
Hmm.
of
Yeah.
choice and also chance, circumstance. In fact, when I was at the conservatory in Kansas City in my undergrad, we had a pretty robust uh, flow of Korean students coming to learn classical bel canto style singing,
Hmm.
and they were unbelievably good at it.
Yeah.
And every single one of them that I met, just extremely hardworking and beautiful voices and all that. So, and I don't think they were being, you know, colonized like that.
Yeah.
That was something they chose. Like they
Sure.
it was something that they wanted to do and they loved it. So I think to me, that's really what it comes down to in my classroom is for me, bel canto singing is not, I don't teach it because it's the only kind of healthy singing. I do though see it as the best in for to access somebody who's never sung before, which is almost all of my students, to teach them a healthy way to sing that focuses on resonance. It focuses on the physiology, the anatomy of the voice. All of those things are inherent in teaching bel canto. And since from a practical standpoint in a high school classroom, you've got to choose a foundation, like you've got to choose something as a foundation, in my mind, is also not the same thing as then saying we will only sing Italian madrigals now
Hmm.
because we've learned bel canto singing principles. It's just a way to access the information so that students have a curriculum to build on. I don't think that means you have to then make value judgments later about what kinds of singing kids go into afterwards, or what types of singing they do in their churches, or whatever.
It does prioritize though, and it does say that. And the problem is the jargon around it. I mentioned that in the article. There's nothing wrong with singing bel canto. There's nothing wrong with performance. It's the jargon around it that this is the way. And I hear that, like, I've heard that from a couple of my voice teachers. I've heard it from current voice teachers I know. Like, this is the healthiest way to do stuff, and that's not true. So to me, it's much more about how are we how are we questioning the norms? And I think that's the point of the article. How are we like asking students to change their voice, and for what, right? Um, I, I have a little bit of a problem with saying that. Oh, you just said something and it flew out of my head. Um, so there's this interesting sort of audaciously titled style of technique called the complete vocal technique. It comes out of, I think the guy was Finnish and now it's somehow in Germany. I don't quite know. We Skyped with a woman who was teaching us some indigenous Finnish music. They kind of have the people in Finland who were native to that land almost look Native American. So there's a whole singing tradition that the choral community has picked up there in Finland, and she was teaching me how to access that voice. So she had been one of these people trained by the Complete Vocal Technique Institute. And again, she talked about breath support in the same way. You
Mm-hmm.
know, and is this hurting? She kept checking, is this hurting you? Because it's new. No, it's not hurting us. But got us to find out different resonators that honestly I had never accessed before. And the way she explained it was like, oh wow. And that was one of the only moments. And I know she's just a much better voice teacher than me because she has experienced all these different vocalities. And I have tried to replicate that again and show people that video, and it didn't. I videotaped her because I was like, but that was the most success we ever had singing in different vocality, because she had a very much broader understanding of the voice. And I just know
Mm-hmm.
that she came out of, I mean, her own story was interesting. She was jazz and opera, and basically the opera teacher said, "You've got to give up this jazz stuff because it's killing your opera voice." And then she was
Mm-hmm.
like, "All right," and walked out. And she can still sing opera beautifully. I mean, she would model that for us on the video. It's an incredible video. But then she also found, all these amazing different ways to resonate the voice and could talk about it very technically. And I just
Hmm.
so anyway, I don't want to get too hung up on the voice. The point of the article is really to ask these questions and to say, well, okay, what are we going towards when we teach? Are we allowing for, you know, my student, what if Jean T had come to the university? Is she going to have a place at the table on the instruction in the classroom? Is she going to be someone who is centered in the curriculum? And I think we do need to be very careful about this idea that we're colonizing or not. Music pedagogy in America, and now it's becoming global, is colonized. Those Korean students that you mentioned wanting to come, certainly there's a huge Christian Presbyterian population there because of colonizers. So they're choosing to come because it's now part of the Korean tradition, which has become a colonized tradition, a colonized culture. And there are still people practicing really what we would consider really radical ways of singing. There's like these Korean mountain songs where people scream until their vocal cords bleed, and we would think like, oh my gosh, that's definitely harmful to the voice. And they develop these calluses, and because of the calluses, that's how they get this style. And I'm thinking like, I don't think I could ever teach that, or maybe I never even want to try that. But that's pre-colonization, right?
Are you
That's a
suggesting
style.
are you suggesting that singing in a way that would make your vocal folds bleed is not unhealthy?
Oh, no. It sounds unhealthy to me. That's why I'm saying I don't ever want to try that. But
Right.
but I'm just saying like are we are we so this is an extreme example, but you mentioned Korea, so I thought I'd bring that up.
Hmm.
Um, just to say that we are part of a colonized tradition. And so that colonized tradition was part of a bourgeois style of singing in Europe, and there are indigenous styles of singing in Europe that still exist, um, that are not bel canto as well, right? I mean, just like we have all sorts of different ways of making music in the U.S. that are not in that style. So
Yeah,
where do
that's
those belong, and how come they're not prioritized, and how come we have a very center of our education when there could be a way of looking at education that is much more, Juliet Hess talks about rhizomatic, much more connected, right? Rhizome is like this plant that has the roots that connect to other rhizomatic plants, and they all feed off of each other, and they all exist because they can do that. They spread out rather than, but they're very strong as well because they're spread out, not because they go down deep. And I just wonder, how siloed we get with our learning, right? What if that bel canto was one of three things that a undergrad student learned how to do in their undergrad in terms of voice training?
yeah. I'm
Um,
not. I definitely wouldn't be opposed to. I've actually been saying for decades that somebody who calls themselves a voice performance major shouldn't only be able to sing one way, and
yeah,
it had nothing to do with the social justice issues that you bring up. My perspective was that if you're going to make a living using your voice, good luck
yeah,
if you can only sing in one specific way. And so I found that a little bit strange. And so for me, I'm just a super practical person. That was where where most of my objection to that idea comes from. So I'm sympathetic to that concept. I definitely understand that. I take a little bit of issue though with, to me, when you talk about, I'm going to go back to the Korean students that I was classmates or my classmates in college, that uh, if it almost sounds to me, and I know this is not what you intend, but it comes across to me as a little bit, when to use the fact that there's colonization going on in Korea that might have influenced their choice to become a classical singer. It almost sounds like that denigrates or belittles their life choice. That
mm,
like they wouldn't have really chosen that if it weren't for white people coming there generations before and making them be Christian or whatever. And I, that rubs me the wrong way, and I don't think that's what you meant. But I
Hmm.
think that's the danger of framing things that way, because that is one way to look at it. You could look at it as a historical oppression that led to another generation of Korean singers singing in a way that I guess is the European way. But for me, I don't see bel canto as something that is attached to race. I think that there are uh, I think there's a whole well, Eric Owens would probably take issue to a really famous black bass opera singer, who's one of my favorite singers, would probably take issue being told that he's singing like in a white way. You know, he's accomplished a ton in his career, and so I struggle with that as an idea. That and I also struggle with my own students. I have so many students of color that love to sing in a classical style because of
Hmm.
the way that it makes them feel and what they feel like they're accomplishing. And then going back to what we were talking about at the very beginning, as we started talking, I think we have to be careful to not mix the two issues of, certain types of music are inherently academic. Bel canto I would put in that category. And then there are some types of singing that that please stay the hell away from academia. Like I don't want you to. Well, I'll just use a less a non-racially charged example. If you are a kid who grows up in Kentucky with a bluegrass background, and you've learned it from your grandpa, and you're playing the jug, and you've got the banjo, and you're doing that whole thing, um, I think probably the worst thing for you to do is to take bluegrass lessons for 4 years, because you're going to probably then start to formalize something that was never intended to be formalized. It was intended to be inherent, organic, learned over time, learned by experimentation. And bel canto is more of like there is already a prescription for how it's done. It's been studied empirically
Hmm.
for, you know,
Yeah. So that brings up a good point. I mean, so a lot of this hasn't been studied, right? A lot of quote unquote other music styles haven't been studied, right?
Mhm.
And that's why I'm advocating that they do belong in the university. Um, there are a lot of people studying bluegrass music, but they're called ethnomusicologists. They're not called voice professors, and and that's sad, right?
Hmm.
Um, there are a lot of people studying hip hop and even the timbral, science behind that. Um, Boy, I wish I could just remember her name right now. Wonderful scholar out of Columbia University. Just Nats was putting out these series of books. I think they were called "So You Think You Can Sing." Dot dot dot, and there's different styles like jazz. Um, but she has a book, "So You Think You Can Sing Gospel," or "So You Want to Sing Gospel." I can't remember exactly how it goes,
Hmm.
um, but it's a nice series. And oh my goodness, what a totally, she's got the science behind it. She's interviewing the famous African American and Afrocentric singers to find out, well, how do we do that, right? So there are techniques, they haven't been studied. You're absolutely right. I don't think that anything singing wise though is academic or not academic. That is suddenly putting a priority over one race over another. I
Oh,
mean,
I disagree with that strongly.
okay,
I think that is a way you're choosing to look at it.
okay,
I'm not choosing to look at it that way. Um,
okay.
Meaning that I have the capacity as a deep thinking person to hold two concepts in my head at the same time, and all of us do, which is that we can say that one thing has a set of or not of priorities of properties. Okay, one thing has a set of properties, another thing has a different set of properties, but they both inherently have value. And
Hmm.
the way I'm approaching it is to simply try to describe the properties of both, of different ways of singing, and then choosing not to attach a value or a priority to them, but simply to just describe them so that they're different.
Hmm.
And I don't see the need to try to make them the same by giving them all the label of academic. To me, I think it's beautiful that some music could be academic and some music could be inherently learned through an oral tradition. I think that's like, to me, that excites me that there could be
Yeah.
both.
Yeah, no, I think we're talking about the same thing, slightly different ways of looking at it. My question then is, why isn't the oral tradition part of academia? Why aren't we
Because it
training?
shouldn't be. Because
How come?
well,
It's complicated and complex, and actually,
right.
when I listen to these Beijing operas, 5 hours memorized oral tradition music. The only thing they have in front of them is the text when they learn it, and oh my goodness, that's complicated. And
Right.
then it's just not singing. It's the particular hand movements that go with it. It's the way that they paint their faces for 6 hours before a show. Um, there's a whole tradition. Why isn't that part of our academic system? We can't do everything, but we can show our students maybe 2 or 3 or 4 different ways of doing something where one thing doesn't have the apples, the most apples in the basket, right?
Right.
And it does help to decentralize education so that we're not looking at something as better, but we're looking at something, I think, like what you were saying, in a comparative way. And you
Mm-hmm.
can hold 2 things in your head or 5 things in your head or 10 things. I think we're just stuck on the one thing in general, right? It's an
Right.
unquestioned thing right now. Um, it's not totally unquestioned because these articles have been out for years and years,
Yeah.
questioning these things. But
And we're having this conversation right now.
yeah, exactly.
So okay. So the reason I say it shouldn't be in academia, again, is not because I think there's a bias that comes. It's an implicit bias from from certain types of people that hold academia as, like you said earlier, higher learning, as the place where all of this learning must take place. I would take the contrary view, which is there are certain things that academia would just ruin, because of
Mm,
the nature of how academia is structured, the very properties that require its, like you would say, systems, but the systems of formalizing how it's taught in and of itself would ruin it. So again, when I say certain types of music shouldn't be in academia, I don't mean because they're less valuable.
mhm.
It's because they are so valuable that I want them to have no grubby fingers of academics, no offense,
Yeah.
touching them. I want them to be free to live and evolve like they have for centuries on their own without a formalized way of education. Some music needs that, in my opinion.
Yeah. Okay. I definitely. So I guess maybe then the question is, who's doing that teaching? I'm working with a Malaysian colleague and I'm teaching a course with him in Malaysia this summer, with Butler students and Malaysian students. He grew up doing like 40 different styles of Malaysian music, sitting on doorstep after doorstep, traveling around the country. He would just sit on someone's doorstep for 3 months and just learn
Mm-hmm.
how to do this different, and from one region to the other, completely different style of music. Um, he then wanted a job in academia, so he got his master's. So that's like the minimum requirement. So it was a Western degree. He went to the US and got it, came back, and now he solely teaches traditional Malaysian music. That's weird for his students because in Malaysia, the standard is Western European style. I went to
Right.
one of their end of year juries, and the students came out in this beautiful, beautiful garb that is traditional to the country and probably represented different regions that they came from. I'm not really sure. And I was like, okay, now I'm going to hear a Malaysian piece. And I heard Carl Mio Ben and all the all the different. I mean, the same stuff I grew up with in my education. I was like, oh man. But anyway, so he has about 20 students, which is his max load that he can handle, and he's the only person in Malaysia who's teaching at the university level. But he grew up in that tradition. That's who I would want teaching that music.
Right.
And I don't think he's doing it exactly the way his dad taught him and how these other people that he sat on doorsteps with taught.
Mm-hmm.
And they've given him that freedom to do that. And I think that's where you're right. Academia can certainly screw it up if we start testing, because that music was never tested, right?
Right. Right. Yeah.
It was never like, you must pass this jury and then you can get your upper divisional and then you can graduate. he's like, I'm going to take these kids as far as they can go in 4 years. And he takes them out into, one of the things we're doing is we're going out into the bamboo forest, and they're going to teach us how to make instruments, because that's the first thing you must do as a musician, is to make your own instrument. So we're going to cut down the bamboo, put it together, and then you have your instrument, and that becomes kind of your mode of learning. Like they say, you have to learn from the instrument, which is totally like, what? I had to learn from a teacher. And then music is for community, and music is for healing and even spiritual healing. And they performed, like he and his dad would go to Kuala Lumpur and perform. They were out like maybe 2 hours outside of Kuala Lumpur, but just to make money. But then when they went back to their village, the village gathered, the group gathered, and they would music together. And not one person was more important, unless there was a problem, and they would put the person who had a problem. They just went through a divorce. They put him in the center of the circle, and they sang and healed that person. And the community would say, "I'm here for you," you know.
Right.
And I think like, whoa, if my students had a sustainable musical experience like that in an academic setting, and we gave them tools to be able to do that, imagine what society would look like. Imagine how they would walk out of the door and think to themselves, wow, I can do my ISMA competition. I can do some, social work here in the classroom. I can connect it to math. I can connect it to different aspects of life and society. That's why I love that Jorgensen quote so much. She says, why isn't the question is, why isn't choral singing or music education connected to social justice? There needs to be maybe a question like that, instead of saying, well, how come it has to be, or how come it should engage with this? Because, as she says, music engages with all aspects of life. Education engages with all aspects of life. You put them together, it becomes a social experience. It becomes a societal. I want my students to become a better society, rather than what they might remember that performance, but what does that actually do in the end? Right. And we have performances twice a semester at Butler. I go conduct people with, at high school clinics and get them ready for their competitions and everything. Like I don't want to toss that out, because that's certainly been an amazing thing that we've accomplished in the choral culture, is that high school students today are sounding, I don't know, 50% better than they did 20 years ago when I got into this. It's ridiculous. But again, I have to stop myself and question the word better, they sound great, but then there are kids that pee themselves on stage at these competitions. And then the teachers don't stop and excuse them. They just go right through the piece and finish. And the kid gets reamed out afterwards for getting so nervous, how is that?
That is a bit of a paradox. I'd like to take a brief second to remind you about ways that you can support the mission of this podcast if you feel like it's benefiting you in any way. Of course, the big things are subscribing on your podcast app. Rating it is a great way to get other people to be able to see the podcast, sharing episodes on social media, going to the Choralosopher's Facebook page to leave your comments about what you thought about the episode or points that were brought up by myself or the guests. These are all things that help get the show in front of other choral directors. If it's benefiting you, it might benefit them. So please help me spread the word in those ways if you can. Now back to the show. Okay, I want to talk next about a quote that you have in the article, which I agreed with, but then probably, I'm just guessing, based on our conversation so far, we might agree with it for different reasons. So I want to see what you feel like there. There's a heading in there where it says it's called "Becoming Toward," and then the quote underneath is to the question, what is the best way to teach music? The best response is probably, that depends on what you want to achieve, and which I completely agree with. And it kind of speaks a little bit to the criticism I think you're undertaking in this article towards the performative nature of choral music. However, I agree with the quote slightly in support of performative choral music, and in the sense that that is also a valid goal. And so again, it goes back to what I was saying before, where if where you can hold different ideas in your head at the same time and not attach priorities to them or values to them, but just hold them as different concepts. Where I agree with the quote, it's probably out of context, but that if the goal is to have your ensemble sound like the Tallis Scholars,
Mm-hmm.
then there is a best way to do that.
Sure.
There is a best way to teach that. Now, if your goal is to have a choir, and my career is kind of unique because I work with professional singers, but I also work with 14-year-olds who have never sung before. I would have different goals with those kids that I would have with my professional ensemble. So I think it's okay to not have the same goal all the time. And you tell a story in the article that about a time when you were doing a project with a choir where there's interaction between some of the choirs in the UAE, and there was a goal, like a social justice kind of goal, and community building goal there. And so obviously the way you rehearse the choir in that environment and the way you teach the music would probably be very different than if you were standing in front of a performance-based ensemble that was putting together a performance for an ACDA national convention or something like that. And so I think my criticism is the tone of the article makes it seem almost like you're doing one of the things that you're criticizing, which is making one of those goals a priority over the other. And I'm going to suggest that there's room in the choral profession to have all of those goals, to be able to do all of those things, but trusting the educator in the situation they're in to make the goal that works the best for their situation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, because I certainly don't want to limit anybody. I'd rather the article expand people's, notions of what's possible. I think one of the things that I was really looking at is how does choral culture do things that we may not readily see, that we may not readily recognize. There was this. I'm trying to look for it now. The one article I referenced that talked about pre-service teachers who were exposed to a lot of urban education system or settings, and then they were given a whole lot of social justice kind of practicums and things like that, and then they actually then decided to go out into to not teach in the inner city there, but then to go out to the suburbs and teach in poor communities, but there were poor white communities. And then when asked about why did they want to do that, and there's nothing wrong with that, the reason was because it resembled their high school, because they went to competitions. And so probably, I'm guessing, the high school teacher that took them to competitions, at least in Indiana, everyone does competitions. It's not questioned. There are a lot of, I don't want to say everybody, but I'm sure there are some people that have like boycotted it. But it's like, I get a lot of calls like, hey, can you help us come get ready for the competition? And I got to say, no, sorry, I'm helping out like 5 other choirs that week. They're all doing it. And they probably don't think to themselves, I'm doing this to the student. But then these students who actually would prefer to do, the thing that they really wanted for their students was competition. They chose that other school. And so, so it was the thing that stuck out the most to them. One of the faults of that course that I taught, and I consider it a fault looking back on it, even though we called it an informance rather than a performance. And it was great. It was a meeting point for the high school choirs we had worked with. We had 180 people on stage. The UAE choir some of the members of the UAE choir were able to be there. We even had this Brazilian choir there virtually singing with it. It was awesome. It was a really great concert, but I still wish we hadn't ended the semester that way, because what the students remembered the most was that concert. And I thought,
and you see that as a negative?
Well, it was a specific course that was to teach social justice concepts through choral singing, and I was trying to figure out in my own kind of pedagogy, can social justice be taught better through the choral experience? Can we have a central emotional connectivity and also still have very critical dialogue? around these topics. And I think it did, because some of my other colleagues said, "Oh my gosh, who teach social justice courses like in English and different subjects?" They said there's at least 2 or 3 yelling matches during the semester from our students. And I said, "Well, I guess that's good, because we didn't have any yelling matches." And some of the
Hmm.
students said like the music helped them reflect on the critical dialogue they had had, and because they were able to see each other's identities. Some of the students were in all the dominant court categories: white, male, Christian, able-bodied, and some were not, and had different intersections of minoritized backgrounds, and were minoritized on a daily basis for being black, for being trans, or whatever. And the dominant students in the interviews said, "Well, I was able to sing this song, but then reflect about my friend. I realized my friend, who I had known for 2 years, was actually going through something very deep and complicated and horrible. And my question now is, how can I support them? How can I be a good ally?" But then they would hear like the refrain of the music in their head, and that to me was like, okay, good. This was something that accomplished more than. But in the interviews, a lot of the students were also just like, "Man, that performance." And I still, like, on Facebook, you see like the photos and the replays, like memories years later of the performance. And it was an awesome performance. Like I was like on an emotional high that day.
Yeah. So here's my observation. Of course, I wasn't there, but it sounds like your a priori goal, your hypothesis, you could say,
Mhm,
for this experiment was that trying to achieve a situation where certain social justice concepts are the primary goal of that experiment. But the result you saw afterwards was that the students remembered the performance. And so, am I summarizing that
yeah,
correctly? I don't want to put words in
yeah,
your mouth.
exactly.
Um, so, what that says to me, as an outside observer, is that it's maybe possible that that is just anecdotal evidence that music transcends those things, and that that's one of the most powerful things about music, and maybe why so many of us love it,
Hmm.
is that in the memory that they all had being from the performance, to me seems like that's obvious that that would be the case. In other words, but I don't think you should discount. So give yourself some credit, is what I'm basically
Uh-huh.
saying. That don't assume that because their memories and their reflection on that event seemed to be centered on the performance does not mean they didn't learn those other things. But music has a very transformative effect on people
Mhm,
that I would say without that performance, they might have gotten nothing out of it.
mhm,
And it's because of the music and because of the learning of the music, and whether we like it or not, the performance is when those emotions culminate for a lot of kids that learn to sing.
yeah,
It's when they get up on stage and overcome their
yeah,
fear, overcome their uh, or a feeling of completing an assignment,
mhm,
even if it's as simple as that. And so I don't know that so I would see it basically as not only would I assume that that would happen, what you just described, but I would also say that's a good thing. And now, if you were to press them a little bit harder, individually, on the things that you taught during that time and the things that you learned, I bet you
yeah,
they would remember those things too. But I'm going to shift gears one other thing from your article
mhm,
that I agreed wholeheartedly with. As you can tell, there are some things that I didn't quite see the way you see them, but the one thing that you criticized in the article that I was just like applauding the whole time, which was the competition stuff.
mhm,
Um, that drives me crazy too. I okay. So my program, just to give you some background, again, over 300 kids. We're suburban, relatively affluent, but fairly culturally diverse um, program. That we would have the support in the community if I were to choose to be competing all year long, and we would probably do really well.
mhm,
But in my mind, music is not a competition. It just isn't. And I think the one. So I agreed with that. You kind of throughout the article popped back at that topic of the idea that the competitive nature of our classrooms oftentimes can lead to some of these culturally normative scenarios, which I agree with that. But mostly, again, from the practical standpoint of I can't wrap my mind around where we get or why we insist on music having its validity in trophies and in ratings or scores. And so we do one competition every year, and it's the one competition that like I have to do. It's like it's so ingrained.
Yeah.
If I could get out of that one, I would. And I take some flack from my colleagues about that because they know I feel that way.
Mm-hmm.
Like they know I feel that I like we go to this because we have to, and all of that. And my students know it too. I talk to them. I set it up for them as guys. We don't care what score we get. Like this is not. We're not going there for a rating. We are going there. The one good thing we get out of them is we get some comments from people who aren't me.
Right.
And that's great.
Yeah.
I love that. But what their opinion of us quantified by a score that they tend to give us at the end of the day is just not important. They don't know you as well as I do. They don't know where you've come from. They don't know where you started to where you are now. So all of those things seem. So I really applaud that aspect of your article that was critical of that, because I think we do need to criticize that a little bit more.
Yeah, and all these little juncture points that I mentioned, big ones actually. To me, again, it comes back to who are we doing this for? You know, and who do we not know that we're not doing this for? That was a tough one to say.
Yeah.
Who sees our audition criteria and clicks away? It turns out that Lin-Manuel Miranda, he did a theater program, but I don't think he learned music in the schools, and now he's a freaking billionaire, right? And he made a few of the most really impactful musicals, and continues to just flourish. What if maybe we would have ruined him in academia?
Yes,
right?
That's what I would claim.
But that says like we should change academia. It shouldn't be. Like Lin-Manuel Miranda should flourish wherever Lin-Manuel Miranda goes. Things need to be a little bit reprioritized, and so it just when I got up there in the UAE, first couple performances, I was like, all right, I've got to come out of the canon, so to speak, and just prove to this campus that it was a great thing that they hired me. These students have to sound great. I mean, literally, that was in my mind. And I feel ashamed saying that on a choral podcast that you're going to put out there, but there it is. And after a while, it was like, but these kids are, oh my gosh, they're transforming. Having gone from zero singing in public to we're up here on a stage, or we're coming out of rehearsals, the students were standing taller because they knew like something had happened. They were the ones that actually taught me choral dialoguing, because they had to ask a lot of questions. Well, why do we have our vowels that way? Like I was trying to bel canto their Arabic vowels, and it sucked. It was bad.
Well, yeah.
It was like so bad. And they're like, can we just someone was like, can we just sing it the way we're supposed to sing it? So it's like, yeah. And guess what? The tuning happened. The blend happened. They were more together because there weren't little aberrations of pitch and weird stuff happening here. And then we would do Mozart, and then they would also learn how to sing that way. And they were fine with that. But it just made me think like, who am I doing this for? And once I started reprioritizing the students, not just their interests, but their identities, right? And figuring out like, oh, this is just so much, what we're teaching here is so much more than that performance. And the students would say that too. I mean, it was the dinners after the rehearsals, it was the tours, right? And a lot of choral conductors have these similar experiences. But when we put the pressure on the students that the performance is the top, like we say words like my top choir. And what we mean is the choir that can perform the best. But sometimes you find yourself loving the choir that isn't the top choir
Mm-hmm.
because of,
And that's okay.
yeah, because of the other things that that choir brings.
Right.
I have sometimes many more transformative experiences with my church choir, who they wouldn't consider themselves, they would say, we're not musicians, we just show up to church choir and you let us sing. But
Mhm.
but my God, like, you know, I will like be in the middle of conducting and crying on a Sunday morning because of the way what's going on there in that moment.
Mhm.
And I don't always have that with some of my students who are like thinking that this, oh, we have to be perfect, and kind of like the idea of perfect is not always the same as good, right?
Right.
Um,
Well, that
so
goes back to it goes back to the "What are your goals?"
right,
quote, and especially with the church choir. And I didn't mention the church choir, but that's another situation where the goal is not to sound like the Tallis Scholars. The goal
right,
is to worship.
right.
It's a worship goal. And so, yeah, like when I work with church choirs, I do talk to them about, there's a certain amount of in tune that we need to be, or else the congregation will not have
Right.
an experience, because they're going to be worried about what we sound like. We could actually take them out of worship but if we don't sing the right notes or we don't sing the right rhythms. But at the same time, I'm not going to drive them as hard towards a certain standard that I would to a professional ensemble, or even to my most advanced, which I call my top group
Hmm.
in high school, my most advanced group, simply because it's more descriptive and it doesn't have that, like you were saying before, that prioritization. They're advanced because of the things they've learned to do, but they're not, doesn't mean I like them better.
Right,
It's just,
right.
they just do more difficult stuff and have a higher time commitment and all that. So yeah, I think that those are all good things, and I've really appreciated talking through this stuff with you. I think that these are important conversations that can be approached from all kinds of different ways, and so I appreciate you taking the time to come on and do this.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. This was great.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it, and like I said, I will link to the article in the show notes so that people can read it for context if they'd like to, and I encourage you guys out there listening to do that. And I'll also put a little bit more about John and his background so that you can get to know his perspective as well. And as always, to keep the conversation going, I'm sure John would be okay with hearing from people if
Definitely.
they have thoughts about this, and of course, everyone who listens to the show knows that I am as well. So thanks a lot, John. And thanks for coming on, and have an awesome day.
You too. Thanks, Chris.
As always, thanks for sticking around to the end of the episode. If you're still here, my assumption is that you found something at the very least interesting in today's topic and conversation. I hope you did. And if so, like it or not like it, it's very helpful if you do a couple things after the episode is over. If you have not yet subscribed to the show on the app that you use to listen to podcasts, please do that. Also, you can leave comments. That's very helpful in getting other people to see the show. If you leave comments in the app that you're using to listen, that's very helpful. You can leave a review, essentially. It's like Yelp. Or on choralosophy.com, on the actual page for this episode, it's a WordPress site, so you can leave comments there. You can also leave comments at the Facebook group Choralosophers, which is a private group. You will have to acknowledge that you listen to the show to be let into that now. That's a new rule. That page is getting large. I want to make sure that it stays people who are listening to the show so that they have the context. So those are all different ways that you can be involved in keeping these conversations going. Finally, don't forget to check out ryanmain.com for some great choral music and arrangements. Self-published guy doing his own thing, so check out his stuff. And sightreadingfactory.com, which is an awesome resource for music literacy. You can enter choralosophy at checkout on both of those websites to get 10% off. Be sure to check out the next episode coming to you next week.